Well, hey there, we're back. So apologies for missing the last couple of weeks. I've actually been at a conference in Germany, so hence why I haven't been here to record any of these episodes, but we are back, so we'll continue on with our story of Galatians. So where we got to last week, we're still working through Galatians 1, moving into Galatians 2 slowly. But what we initially dealing with in this stage of the letter is Paul giving just the true account of his life and just explaining to these Galatians what actually happened to him in response to some false stories, some lies that have been spread about his past and particularly about his training as an apostle. If you remember what he's been accused of is that after he'd become a Christian, he was in Jerusalem and that he trained with Peter and the other apostles, and he'd learned his gospel from them. They had trained him in the gospel message that he was supposed to take out, and so that was all good and well. But then, having left Jerusalem and having gone out into the Gentile world, he's dumbed it down a little bit, or he's softened the message by insisting that Gentiles do not need to be circumcised. And so he's really just trying to give them more of a seeker-sensitive version of the gospel. At least this is what they're accusing him of. And again, this is all based on a lie. It's based on a falsehood that Paul had been in Jerusalem for many years or for however long, enough to be trained, but then to take that message and take out the difficult bits and to present to them an easier pill to swallow. And so whoever the opponents are in Galatia, this is what they're accusing Paul of. This is what they're using to try to discredit his message. They're trying to bring the Galatians over to their side, which is to say, you need to be circumcised, that you need to basically become Jewish in order to become Christian. And what you've heard, there's some truth in what Paul was saying, but he hasn't given you the full message. And so this is what you need to adhere to. And again, just in order to, to bolster their argument, they first of all have to discredit Paul's and just discredit the man himself, but effectively just call him to make him out to be a charlatan, make him out to be one of these sort of false preachers that's just in it for themselves. And so Paul's having to correct the record here, telling the story as it actually happened, and really just trying to make the point that, yes, he did go to Jerusalem, but it wasn't in the way that it's been portrayed. In fact, as we saw in the last couple of episodes, what Paul has pointed out to them is that as soon as he got saved, as soon as he was converted to Christianity, he went straight into Arabia. In fact, and he was there for 3 years. And we've speculated a bit as to what might have happened when Paul was there. But effectively, he was probably just figuring out, what does all of this mean? And so where we got to last week, he'd finished that time in Arabia. Again, we just don't know what happened there. He was there for 3 years, and we can speculate at the absolute best, but there's just no way of knowing exactly what took place. But he says after 3 years, that was the first time he went back to Jerusalem. And he says there in verse 18, I only went for 15 days. And the only person that I saw when I was there was Cephas or Peter. And so, yes, indeed, I did see, I was with Peter at some point after my conversion, but not for any length of time, only 15 days, and certainly not to learn anything from him. It had been 3 years. I'd been figuring out this gospel for myself. I'm pretty familiar with Scripture. I'm not dumb when it comes to this stuff. I'm a bit of an expert. So, there wasn't a lot that I needed to be taught about this. And when I was there, it was only just to check in and see how Peter's going and maybe catch up with some old friends in Jerusalem. Who knows what he was doing there? But the point was that when he first went to Jerusalem, it was not for the reasons that have been said, that he was there to learn. He was just simply there just to check in, just to see how things were going with Peter and whoever else might be there. But then he goes on in verse 21 and he says, and after that, I disappeared back into Syria. I went back home. I went back to Tarsus, and I was there for years. And again, we don't know what Paul was doing there. We just simply don't know. No doubt continuing to sharpen his gospel and study and really work through the issues that he was going to really need to be confident in, to be able to go out and be a minister. He knew what his calling was. He'd known that since the very beginning. But in order to ensure that he was going out and actually preaching the correct message. He's probably figuring that out for himself, and maybe even doing some evangelizing, probably doing some missionary work even in the local region. And again, who knows? But the point being that for a very, very long time, he was not with the disciples. He wasn't in Jerusalem, and there was nothing that they did in those early days that contributed anything really to what his eventual gospel had become. And so we'll pick up our story today in chapter 2, where he's continuing on this testimony. And again, the point being, he's been to Jerusalem, but only for a very short time. But then after that, he disappeared into Syria, and he was there for about 9 or 10 years. So we can probably date this maybe between the year 37 and about 46. Of course, we can only speculate, but the best guess might be around about that period. So from about 37, Paul had been converted in 33, 34, and then gone into Arabia, so maybe 3 years later, so it brings us to maybe 37, and then up to about the year 46. Again, he's back home, he's in Cilicia, we don't know what he's doing, but he's just basically there for the better part of a decade. But it was about that time that the Christian movement was really starting to spread. So it had been based in Antioch, and it had really only traveled so far north as Antioch, and it was keeping itself amongst the Jewish Christians. It had only been working amongst that sort of more introverted, more exclusive sort of a group. But over time, what had been happening in the city was that more and more Greek-speaking, Judaized Gentiles were becoming Christians. So, what you get in early Judaism is you get Jewish people who are born Jewish families, Jewish bloodline, who are a part of Judaism. Just by dint of their birth, they're part of Judaism. But you also have an increasing number of people who are converting to Judaism. So Gentiles who are coming into Judaism and seeing the benefit of Judaism. One of the great, I guess, benefits of Judaism and what it offered was just the idea of a single God, and a God who was very, very clear about who he was, what he expected from his people, as opposed to the many thousands of gods that a Greco-Roman person would need to worship. And more than that, not just they had to worship them, but they had no idea what the gods wanted. It was just such a convoluted, such a confused, sort of form of worship. And really, the gods themselves were absolutely just abhorrent. They were just the most immoral beings that you could possibly conceive of. And so the idea of one God who gave us a written set of commands, he wrote down what he actually wants from us, and he told us who he is. That's a very simple, that's a very clear way of relating with the one true God. And so Judaism was very attractive. People were drawn to it, and you'd find many people converting to this movement. And what we see them in the Bible, we meet them, they're called God-fearers. So when you see that term God-fearer, what that's referring to is a Gentile who's converted over to Judaism. And so what would have happened in the early church is that the movement stayed within the synagogue. It stayed within the Jewish people who understood Scripture, who were waiting for a Messiah. All that message looked like was the Messiah has come. He's here. It was Jesus. We crucified him. Oops. But he came back to life, and he was the one. So that's really as simple as the message needed to be. And of course, prove that from Scripture. But everybody already understood the Scriptures from which they were proving that Jesus was the Messiah. So that was all pretty straightforward. And even for the God-fearers, that would have had something of an understanding of Torah and understanding of Scripture, it would have been easy for them to understand that. But probably actually easier for them to convert to Christianity. Just the idea of God becoming a man would have been much harder to conceive of in the Jewish world. That would have been much more like blasphemy. That would have been, worshiping a man, worshiping somebody who, to say that God is a man is to go against the very notion of what Yahweh said, which, I am who I am. There will be no images of me. You can't see me. And that's the whole point. I'm invisible. You're not meant to be able to see me, and so I reveal myself through Scripture. And so the idea of a God revealing himself as a man is problematic for the Jews. It's, as Paul says, it's a stumbling block. It's something over which the very notion of that is something the Jews would trip over. But for a Gentile, the idea of God becoming a man, we've got those ideas already. You know, we see it in the emperor every day, but we've always had that tradition, particularly in the Greek world, of kings and men being gods. And so for them, they didn't have that, the cultural baggage, I guess, going all the way back to Moses. For them, it was an easier transition to come into Judaism and believe that Christ is the Messiah and then move over to this new movement. So a lot of the initial church movement would have happened probably amongst those God-fearers. At the very least, it stays within the synagogue. It stays within a group of people who are already familiar with Torah and a part of Judaism. But then as it starts to spread out, it's going into that Gentile world. It's going to people who have got no understanding of Judaism. They've got no relationship with that movement whatsoever. And so as it's spreading into that world, it's much harder to contain. At least if it's amongst God-fearers, they're already within our community. They're people that are already part of our synagogue community. It's easier for us to gather them. But when it's going out into the Gentile world, it's much more difficult for us to control that, to sort of get a handle on that, in large part because we don't understand that world. If you've been raised in the synagogue and raised in a very tight Jewish community, you don't have a strong concept of the Greek world because that's abhorrent to you. That's just not a world that you engage with. You don't eat with those people. You don't engage with those people, or at least as little as possible. And so as the message is going into there, it's threatening just to blow up. It's threatening just to spread everywhere because of this new enthusiasm. People are coming to the faith and they're very excited about it. They're going to want to tell their friends and their friends. And so it starts to get out of control. We need somebody who can get out in front of it and lead it, somebody who can actually, be a vessel, or be somebody that can really sort of channel it effectively into the Gentile world. And so this is where we pick up our story. We pick up the story actually in Acts chapter 11, where Barnabas, who's one of the leaders of the church. Barnabas is one of the chief figures now in the church in Antioch. He realizes, hey, we've got to do something about this. And so he knows about Saul. He knows that Saul is back in Tarsus. And, we've talked about it before. Saul has all the credentials of somebody who is the ideal minister to go into the Gentile world. And he has that call in as well. He's been called to be that apostle to the Gentiles. So everything is there. Somebody just needs to go and get him. And so Barnabas in Acts 11:25, he goes off to Tarsus and he looks for Saul and he brings him back to Antioch with the intention of, working with Saul to get the message more controlled amongst this new Gentile revival that's taking place. So this brings us up to the year 46, and we find out from that account that Saul stays in Antioch for the next year. So for 12 months, they stay in Antioch. They're doing their work. Paul's probably, integrated himself into the church there. All the things are starting to fall in place. So they spend about a year there, but then we pick up the story in the next year, in the year 47, and we've actually got two accounts of what happens here, because this is when Paul goes to Jerusalem for a second time. So the key account from Paul's own hand comes from Galatians 2:1. So we'll read that, and then we'll compare that with the parallel account that we find in Acts chapter 11. So in Galatians 2:1, it says, then after 14 years, so 14 years being from the time of his conversion, so 3 years in 3 years in Arabia, and then probably another 9 or 10 years in Antioch, back in Tarsus, and then probably another year just hanging out in Antioch. So, 14 years, give or take, thereabouts. So he says, then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. All right, so he goes to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and he says to the Galatians, I went there on account of a revelation. And so we can assume that this seemingly parallel story in Acts is is what coincides with that and sort of fills in a bit more of the detail of what's going on there. So we pick it up, Acts chapter 11, 27. It says, during this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. This they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. All right, so there seems to be sort of a two birds, one stone situation going on here. So it's the year 47, probably early in the year. He's been in Antioch for 12 months at this stage, working closely with Barnabas. Barnabas, of course, is the one that Paul eventually goes to Galatia with. So Paul and Barnabas initially are missionary partners. So two things seem to be going on at the same time. The first one seems to be this revelation. So this Agabus has prophesied that there's going to be a famine, and so what the Christians there decide to do is to gather up some resources to send down to Jerusalem. Now, the Christians in Jerusalem have already been suffering some persecution. They've been suffering, just from their own Jewish people because they've become Christian. And this has really been going on since the early days. So even going back to Acts chapter 2, where everybody's selling all their houses and supporting each other. The reason for that is because when you become a Christian, you become an apostate. You get kicked out of your family, you get ostracized from the community, and you are left to your own devices. And so unless someone is there to support you, you're in pretty bad straits. So they're already suffering, and if you add to that a famine, that's probably going to make matters just a whole lot worse. So the Christians there decide, well, let's send some resources back up to Jerusalem in order to support the Christians there. So that's one of the motivations for going. But what Paul indicates as well is that he goes there in order just to set before them the gospel that he's already been preaching. And so this is the key point that he wants to make to the Galatians. He's been preaching this gospel now for 14 years. He's been out figuring it out, preaching it, probably, who knows what sort of missionary work he's been doing. But he's been doing this for a long time now. 14 years is a long time. So Paul has been preaching this same message for many, many years now. And he decides now's probably a good time just to go up to Jerusalem, just to make sure that we're all still on the same page. It's not that I need to learn anything from these guys, but I thought I'd better just check in. I've been doing a lot of work out there, and look, they are still the head of the church. Peter is still the head of the church, and James as well. Those guys are still the ones who are ultimately overseeing this whole movement. I'm a part of that, and so in a way, I'm kind of working for those guys to some extent, but at the very least, they're the recognized leaders of this thing of which I'm a representative. So if I'm going to go out there and be preaching Christ, I am actually doing it on their behalf. That they, whatever I'm doing is going to be a reflection, is going to be reflected back in Jerusalem. And so at the very least, I better just double check. At least just let them know what I've been doing, give some reports. I mean, he's probably got a whole lot of great stories and good news about everything that he's been doing. And most importantly, what he is going back to tell them is that I'm preaching a circumcision-free gospel. I've been preaching to Gentiles, and I've been insisting that they do not need to be circumcised. And the reason we can assume this is because he takes Titus with him. Now, we don't know much about Titus. We don't know where he came from. We don't know really anything. We don't even know when he met Paul. Presumably, he's a young man, like Timothy, maybe a similar age to Timothy. And Paul has already got this idea of mentorship, discipleship, where he's training up the next generation of church planters and leaders. So Titus kind of makes cameo appearances throughout Paul's time. Particularly in 2 Corinthians, Titus is one of the key figures in sort of mediating in a situation that the Corinthian church and Paul's relationship had blown up, and Titus was a mediator in that particular circumstance. So Titus is clearly an important person in Paul's life, but he doesn't sort of have a main role in the actual narrative, but he's definitely there behind the scenes throughout Paul's life. And of course, later on, a letter gets written to Titus by Paul. Now that he's a church planter, he's pastoring the churches in Crete, and so Paul's writing to him there. So he's part of the story, but at this point, he's quite young, and Paul takes him with him to Jerusalem. So what is the point of bringing Titus? Well, Titus is a Gentile. And we know this because as the passage continues, we find out that Titus is uncircumcised. So he's clearly a Gentile. He's a Gentile convert. He's clearly become a convert through Paul's ministry. And subsequently, Paul's probably identified him as a future church planter or a future pastor. And so it's taken him under his wing to disciple him as kind of the next generation of church leaders. But he takes him up to Jerusalem to exhibit him, really, as, this is exhibit A of what it looks like when a Gentile comes to the faith but isn't circumcised. And so I guess what Paul's probably anticipating in going to Jerusalem is that there's going to be people up there who are going to give pushback. And in fact, he's probably certain of this because this is exactly what happens. But he's probably knows in advance that there are going to be people in Jerusalem that will be giving him pushback. Maybe not Peter and John and James and the other guys, but certainly others that are influential within the church. They're going to give some pushback. And so what Titus becomes is literally exhibit A of what it looks like to be a Gentile and a Christian and not be circumcised. So Paul's point then is to exhibit Titus as exhibit A. This is what it looks like to be a Christian and not be circumcised. And so really just to testify that this circumcision-free gospel works. Peter and James and John, they've only been preaching to Jews. They probably don't have the experience of preaching to non-circumcised people. And so maybe they had some questions about it, but Paul's got the proof. Here he is. He's not circumcised. He doesn't need to be. He's clearly a Christian, and all of that is good. And so as an overall objective to this particular trip, it's to simply just check in and say, look, I've been preaching this message for 14 years. I'm just letting you know what I'm doing, and it's working. Here's Titus. Clearly it's working. So that's it. Just letting you know. And he says, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't running in vain. But of course, he was confident that he wasn't. And even if Peter and John had pushed back, he probably would have said, look, let's just agree to disagree. But for whatever it was, he was confident, and so he was going to carry on with what it is that he was doing. And so that was the whole point of the visit. It was to and this is what he's trying to stress to the Galatians. When I did go there and see all the other apostles, it wasn't to learn anything from them. It was only to inform them of what I'd been doing for 14 years. And so that's, for whatever else happened when I was there, it certainly wasn't to be trained and then go later on and change the message somehow. I was just telling them the message that I've been preaching for a very long time, and to you Galatians, it's exactly the same message that I preached to you guys. And so he carries on in verse 3, he says, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. So I took Titus up, but he wasn't forced, and even if people were trying to compel him, which clearly some of them were, we weren't falling for it. Titus wasn't going to leave that place circumcised. Now, we can only speculate what might have happened at this meeting. One possibility is that the chief apostles, the recognized ones, Peter, James, John, these guys, maybe they had said to Titus, it would be helpful if he were circumcised. It would be because at least it would help to bridge the gap between, with the other Jewish brothers. Like it would just sort of help to, ease that tension, because we actually see the same thing happening to Timothy. Timothy was in fact circumcised. His mother was Jewish, but his father wasn't, and so by virtue of the fact that his father was a Greek, Timothy wasn't circumcised. But when he was converted, he did. So from birth, even though having a Jewish mother, he remained uncircumcised. But when he became a Christian, he felt compelled to, and the reason for that simply was just to help bridge the gap between the Jews who would have a problem with accepting Gentiles. And so it was more of just to keep the peace. But that's not what Titus felt to do. Titus, for whatever reason, maybe through Paul's encouragement, maybe through his own determination not to be circumcised, he just said, no, that's not going to happen. So there might have been some suggestions, maybe some, just a little bit of hints like this would be good if you could do this. But Paul seems to suggest here that there was another group of people in Jerusalem at the time who were insisting that he be circumcised. They were really putting the pressure, and he talks about them like spies, people that are slipping in to put us back into slavery, like not even Christians but false teachers. Which is, if that's who he's talking about in Galatia, if it's the same group of people, then that would make sense. He doesn't have anything nice to say about the guys in Galatia. seems to be the same with the guys back in Jerusalem. So there seems to be this movement, this group within early Christianity that Paul is absolutely rabidly opposed to. It's like they're everything that is wrong with Christianity at the time. And so Paul is just absolutely vociferously opposed to these people. And when he meets them in Jerusalem, he's opposed to them. They're not brothers. They're not people that are, equal to us in that way. No, they're spies that have slipped in to put us back into slavery. Those ones, and what we can maybe speculate is that it was actually those ones who were putting pressure on guys like John and Peter to insist that Titus be circumcised. So maybe it wasn't even coming directly from them. Paul says they slipped in. They were being very sneaky about it. Maybe behind the scenes, they were saying to Peter and John, hey, look, just make sure you get that Titus guy circumcised. So maybe that's how it came about. But Paul's able to distinguish between the different groups, and he's recognizing where that pressure would have come from. But the point again being that even in the face of pressure from the head of the church, like the pillar apostles, the chiefs of this whole early church, if you're going to listen to anyone, if you're going to take instruction from anyone, it's going to be from those guys. And so to push back against them is also Paul saying, I'm not going to be pushed around by people, even if they are Peter, even if they are John, even if they are literally the brother of Jesus. I'm not going to get pushed around by those guys when it comes to the truth. I'm going to take a stand where it matters. And on this case, it does matter. I'm not going to be pushed around even by those guys, because even if they're insisting that Titus be circumcised, it's only because they're being manipulated into that position. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to compromise this gospel that I've been preaching for all of this time now, and I'm not going to send this message to Titus and any other Gentile that comes after him that really you're better off getting circumcised, if only just not to cause offense. So we're not going to go down that path. It's not going to happen. And so Titus went to Jerusalem, walked away from there, remained uncircumcised, even in the face of pressure. That's what my message is. And so again, this is Paul's message to the Galatian church. If there was any opportunity for me to hear the message and then change it, that would have been it. And even in the face of pressure to potentially change my message, I absolutely didn't do it. I stood firm, and here we are. So that's at least dealing with this suggestion that perhaps Paul changed his message at some point. He didn't. The message I revealed to the guys in Jerusalem was the same one I've been preaching for 14 years. Titus is my best example of that. Nothing changed. But then he goes on in verse 6 and he says, and from those who seem to be influential, what they are makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. And you can sort of hear in this Paul being a little bit snarky, a little bit snide in the way that he's talking about the encounter. He's talking about Peter. He's talking about James, John, the heads of the church, and he talks about them as being, who they seem to be influential, quote unquote. But whatever they are makes no difference to me because God shows no partiality. Like, I don't care what their title is. I don't care what their calling is. I don't care if that literally is the brother of Jesus Christ. It makes no difference to me as to who these people are. So whatever these great people are, and again, keeping in mind this Galatian audience who's thinking, oh, that's Peter. You don't argue with Peter. You don't argue with James and John. Paul's like, whatever. Like, they're just guys. Like, I know those guys. I've hung out with them. They're good. They're okay, but they're not what they're made out to be. And whatever they might say, it's like, well, I know, I'm confident in what I'm saying. So whoever these guys might be, Paul says they didn't add anything to me. So if you're going to try to make this argument that I've learnt my gospel from Peter, James, and John, no. When I was in Jerusalem, let's just be really clear, I didn't come away with any brand new knowledge. All I came away with, as he says in a moment, is just confirmation that everything I'm doing is perfectly fine. Carry on. So they didn't actually add anything to me whatsoever. So there was no new teaching that I received from them. There wasn't any teaching at all. Certainly nothing for me to later on water down so as to make it a bit more palatable for you guys. No, I got nothing from there. Again, it was only to point out what I had confidently been preaching for 14 years, and with all of the proof and the evidence being in guys like Titus. So no, they didn't add anything to me whatsoever during however long that encounter was. On the contrary, he says, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. Again, Galatian audience in mind, who are thinking that Paul has learnt everything he knows from Jerusalem. Paul says, no, when I got there, I didn't actually learn anything at all. In fact, quite the opposite. What they saw was, oh, wow, yeah, Paul's on the money here. You know, whatever Paul's been preaching for the last 14 years is clearly working. There's Titus, Exhibit A, and there's plenty more Gentiles out there just like him. So, no, not only is there nothing to add to Paul's message, but they've actually recognized, and I'm sure this is the thing to keep in mind as well. They would have been hearing reports back constantly over the last 14 years about what this renegade preacher Paul is doing. You know, I mean, Paul's already made enemies. There's no question about that. He's already having debates with people back in Antioch. So there's no question here that people already know within the Christian circles have problems with what Paul's preaching. And the people that have the problems are these Jews that are insisting on circumcision. So there would have already been reports coming back to Peter, James, and John. And of course, you know, you can imagine the whole Chinese whispers things, but the reports that are getting back is probably Paul is just the Antichrist and he's all of these terrible things. And you know how these things work. You've been to church, you know how gossip works. All of that would have been fed back over time to Jerusalem. And there's no way to fact check it. There's no way to verify. They can only go with the information that they're seeing. So this was probably as much of a useful catch up for Peter, James, and John to hear from Paul and hear actually from the horse's mouth what he's actually doing. You know, they see Titus, they hear Paul's message, they go, oh, that's not what we've been hearing. We've been hearing some pretty terrible stuff about you, but it's good to actually get on the same page, just understand each other, both understand where we're both coming from, not to correct each other or not to change anything about each other, but at least just to understand where we're both up to. And so what they have concluded as a result of this time together and as a result of all of these meetings would be that, no, actually, yeah, what we knew from the very early days was that you had a call into the Gentiles, that much we have been familiar with, or if we hadn't been familiar, we are now. And so we can agree, okay, Peter, you've got the call into the Jews and to those that are circumcised, Paul to the uncircumcised, to the Gentiles out in the Greco-Roman world. And so again, we're moving so far from what the Galatians have first heard from these same false teachers, that Paul went to Jerusalem, got taught from Peter, changed the message. No, Paul went to Jerusalem, told them what he'd been preaching for 14 years, and with not to check, hey, can you guys tell me if I'm wrong here? No, I'm just telling you what I've been doing, right? Here's the evidence. So I'm just informing you of what that is. But then so much further from that of, yeah, carry on, great work. Yep, you obviously what God has been doing through you is what we assumed or what we first heard, that you're an apostle to the Gentiles. So that's been affirmed for that. So it was probably just as much putting their minds at rest that what Paul was doing was correct. And ultimately, for them to give him his blessing, not that he was really looking for it, but at least that everybody can agree he's doing fine, let him carry on. And at least hopefully for them to be able to go back to some of these Jews that are influencing them and say, guys, no, it's not what you're saying. No, we've met Paul, we've heard what he's doing, we're on board with all of that because clearly God is at work in what Paul is doing. So he confirms this verse 9. It says, when James and Cephas and John, who seem to be pillars, again, there's that sort of snide, cynical, who seem to be quote unquote pillars, again, Peter's the first pope. Like there are churches named after this guy. He's a saint. He's basically second only to Jesus in some traditions. Peter's an extraordinary guy. And even in the time, he would have had that sort of status about him, from really just pretty much from after the resurrection. Peter sort of had this sort of sense of he was the leader. He was the one that everybody looked to amongst the disciples. And so as the church is growing, Peter is increasingly gaining this reputation and this authority. Just the thought of Peter is something that is probably a little bit intimidating. So he's got that status about him. He's got that gravitas in the early church, as would James being the brother of Jesus and John, these guys, this triumvirate, would have this, just the mention of those three. They are the pillars of the church. Basically what they say goes. They are at the core of all of this. And so Paul goes, yeah, whatever. They're pillars. Okay, fine. Call them whatever you want. They're just three guys that they're nice enough guys, but they're no different to anybody else that I've met. So cool, whatever. But again, and as well too, and you got to hear what Paul's trying to do for these Galatians. This is probably a little bit rhetorical as well. It's not that Paul, denigrates them. It's not that Paul just thinks that they're just, everyday sort of guys. But it's trying to show these Galatians that he's not intimidated by them. Again, they've got this idea that Peter was this great leader and told Paul all of this stuff, and then Paul's rebelling against the great leader. No, they're nothing. Like they're just other teachers like me. You're trying to just bring them all down to the same level to at least make clear to the Galatians, hey, they haven't had that much influence. Really, they haven't had any influence over me at all, except to confirm what I was already doing. So thanks very much. I wasn't going to change, but it's nice to get your blessing. So anyway, who seemed to be pillars perceived the grace that was given to me. They gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So when we talk about this meeting, we refer to it as the Jerusalem Agreement. It's really the first time where Paul, who's already been working for 14 years, and Peter, James, and John have been doing their work for all at the same time, it's where they really first come together and effectively just touch base as to what both of them are doing. They've been working independently and quite clearly doing the same work, both working within their callings. Paul's already been working with the Gentiles, Peter, James, John already to the Jews and the circumcised. They've already been doing what they've been called to do, and they've been doing it independently of each other, and they're having the same results because they're both doing their work according to their calling. They're both doing it according to the leading of God. So everything is already working perfectly fine. The only thing that hasn't happened yet is this connection where they've touched base and recognize that they're both on the same team. They have been, but it's almost like it's halftime. Get back in, regroup. Make sure that we're all on the same page before we go out there and start again. So it's called the Jerusalem Agreement because what they've all agreed is that Paul is the one going out to the Gentiles. They're the ones going to the Jews, and most importantly, that what they preach is a message or is a gospel that doesn't require circumcision. Paul's circumcision-free gospel is correct. Everything he's been preaching is absolutely correct. And what Paul says is they gave him the right hand of fellowship. Basically, they've just, they've shaken hands. They've said, yep, carry on, do what you're doing. And Paul says, not that I needed their blessing and their endorsement. It's nice to have it, but I was going to do it anyway. But we've at least touched base, and so we all agree that this is the correct message. We've got our callings, we've got our independent areas to work in, and so we just need to carry on. And again, in response to these Galatians who are still under the impression that Paul was educated by them and then changed his mind, no. All that happened when Paul eventually did get to Jerusalem and have a meeting with those guys was just to confirm that everybody's doing the right thing and to carry on the way that they were. And so that's the agreement. This is a really pivotal moment, certainly for Paul's ministry, but really in the early church, because it sets the sort of almost a starting point for or sort of it confirms what was already happening, but really sort of puts the rubber stamp on the callings of the different guys. So particularly Peter and Paul, and where they're going to go and how this gospel is going to go out. At the end of the day, we're all working on the same team. We're all trying to achieve the same ends, which is to take the gospel to the world. We need to agree on what that looks like. So for Paul, it's to go into the Gentiles. For Peter, it's going to the Jews. That way we're not doubling up on each other's work. We're not crossing paths. We're not, Peter can be effective and go in areas that Paul's not going to. Paul can do vice versa. And that way the message gets to go out. And that's what all of this is about in the first place. It's about getting the message out in the quickest and most effective way and not getting in each other's way and treading on toes and all of these things that can happen when nobody actually really knows what the other one is doing. So it's a really, really pivotal moment for what this for the direction of the church and for what Paul's about to do, because it's later on in this year that's when Paul first goes to the Galatian churches, and that's when he first starts that missionary journey. So this is really sort of Paul's green light to carry on and to start that work. And so then kind of as a last clause or a last, oh, by the way, can you just, this is one more thing we'll get you to do, Paul. Don't forget the poor. And Paul's like, duh. Like, anything else, Captain Obvious? Like, that's exactly what I'm here to do. Like, well, come on. Like, the only instruction, again, give this, keep this in mind, this Galatian audience. They did give me one instruction. It wasn't about my message. It wasn't, a correction to anything I'm preaching. It wasn't to correct me and say, you go to the Gentiles and stop working with the Jews. No, nothing about what I was already doing did they add to or change or correct. All they did give me instruction to do was don't forget the poor. And Paul's like, yeah, thanks. Wasn't planning to. Like, that's as much as if they added anything, it was only just a reminder. Or if they asked me to do anything, it was only to ask me to do the very thing I was already doing and planning to continue to do. So thanks very much. Nothing's been added, but rest assured, I'll do the thing that you've asked me to do. So anyway, pivotal moment, both for Paul in his ministry and in the early church, but also for these Galatians as okay, guys, whatever you think you know about me is wrong. This is actually what happened. And what I told you was the same thing I've been preaching about for the 14 years before I got there again. Remembering that Paul got to the Galatians in the same year that this meeting took place. So Paul has been preaching this message for 14 years, goes and just checks it in with the guys in Jerusalem, carries on to Galatia, preaching exactly the same message he has for 14 years. Nothing has been added to it. And all that has changed is that it's been rubber stamped by the guys back in Jerusalem. Not that he needed their endorsement, but it's nice to have it, and it's just just an affirmation of what he already knew to be true. So nothing has changed whatsoever. So whatever I told you, Galatians, is the message that I've always preached. Nothing was changed. And again, whatever you've heard, clearly it's false because it's the opposite to what actually happened. However, there's one more event that Paul talks about that took place shortly after this Jerusalem agreement. And Paul, again, brings it up with the Galatians more by way of just showing how maybe their views of Peter are a little bit higher than what they actually should be. And so, just to sort of keep, just try to keep, not to denigrate Peter, but to at least say, look, he's not this great thing that you think that he is. He's a human like what we are. And even in the face of other opposition later on to my message, even against that opposition, I still didn't surrender to this message. So we'll pick up that story next week and look at what took place next between the events of the Jerusalem agreement and when Paul heads off to Galatia. So we'll look at that next week. But anyway, have a great week. It's great to be back, and I'll see you next week. All the best.